Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into a world that history books prefer to whisper about, rather than discuss openly. We're exploring the surprisingly complex, brutally honest, and often misunderstood reality of medieval prostitution. A profession that was simultaneously condemned and tolerated, regulated and reviled. So before we begin this journey into the shadows of medieval society, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you find this content valuable. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's fascinating to see our community spanning different corners of the world. Now, settle in, maybe dim those lights, and let's step back into a time when survival meant making choices that modern society can barely comprehend. You wake up to the sound of church bells echoing through narrow cobblestone streets. But these aren't calling you to morning prayers. They're marking another day in a profession that exists in the murky space between sin and necessity. Your small chamber, barely larger than a closet, sits above a tavern where the smell of stale ale mingles with something far less pleasant. The walls are thin timber, stained with years of smoke and dampness that never quite dries. Your bed is a straw mattress that crunches with every movement, stuffed with whatever materials were cheapest at the market last season. There's no glass in your window, just a wooden shutter that keeps out the worst of the weather but little else. Through the gaps, you can hear the city waking up. Merchants calling their wares, horses clattering over stones, and the ever-present chatter of a world that both needs and despises what you do for survival. Medieval prostitution wasn't the romanticized version you might see in films or novels. It was a harsh economic reality in a world where women had few options for independent income. Most women in your profession didn't choose this life out of desire for adventure or rebellion. They chose it because the alternatives were often starvation, begging, or worse. The medieval world was surprisingly organized about regulating prostitution. Rather than pretending it didn't exist, most cities created specific districts where the trade was permitted and controlled. These areas, often called red light districts even then, due to the colored clothing prostitutes were required to wear, became small communities unto themselves. You weren't just working in isolation. You were part of a network of women, madams, guards, and various other figures who made the whole system function. Your daily routine begins with the practical realities of medieval hygiene, which is to say, very little hygiene at all. There's a basin of cold water in the corner, if you're fortunate enough to afford regular water delivery. Soap is a luxury most can't afford, so you make do with whatever cleaning methods are available. Personal cleanliness isn't just about comfort, it's about business. Clients, even in the medieval period, preferred their companions to be as clean as circumstances allowed. The clothing you wear isn't chosen for fashion, but for function and legal compliance. Medieval cities often required prostitutes to wear specific colors or markings to identify their profession. This wasn't necessarily about shame, though that was certainly part of it. It was about regulation, taxation, and making sure everyone knew exactly what kind of establishment they were entering. Red was the most common color, which is where our modern association between red and prostitution originates. Sometimes it was a red hood, sometimes a red dress, sometimes just a red belt or sash. The specific requirements varied from city to city, but the principle remained the same. Visibility and identification were mandatory. Your first client of the day might arrive as early as dawn. Medieval society woke with the sun, and business began immediately. This could be anyone from a traveling merchant looking for companionship during his brief stay in the city, to a local craftsman seeking relief from a difficult marriage, to a young man whose family had sent him to gain experience before his own wedding. The transactions weren't just about physical services. Often, you provided conversation, companionship, and emotional support to men who had few other outlets for these needs. In a society where marriages were typically arranged for economic or political reasons rather than love, professional companions often filled emotional voids that legitimate relationships couldn't address. Payment came in various forms: coins when available, but just as often in goods, services, or promises. A loaf of bread from a baker, a chicken from a farmer, fabric scraps from a tailor's wife. Medieval economies operated heavily on barter, and your profession was no exception. The challenge was ensuring these payments could actually sustain you through lean periods when clients were scarce. The legal landscape surrounding your work was a patchwork of contradictions. The Catholic Church officially condemned prostitution as sinful, yet many cities licensed and taxed it as a legitimate business. Some areas even had municipal brothels run by city officials. The reasoning was pragmatic rather than moral. Authorities believed that regulating prostitution was better than driving it underground where it might cause greater social problems. Your relationship with the law was complicated. On one hand, you might be protected by city ordinances that established your right to work in designated areas. On the other hand, you remained vulnerable to arbitrary harassment, sudden policy changes, or religious campaigns that could upend your livelihood overnight. The protection was real but fragile, dependent on political winds that could shift without warning. The social hierarchy within the profession was stark and unforgiving. At the top were courtesans who served wealthy merchants or minor nobility, living in relative comfort with fine clothing and private chambers. Below them were the licensed prostitutes working in established brothels with some measure of security and protection. At the bottom were streetwalkers and those working outside the regulated system, facing the greatest dangers and earning the least reliable income. Health was a constant concern in an age without antibiotics or modern medicine. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant and often fatal. Pregnancy was both a professional hazard and a potential economic disaster. Some women knew herbal remedies for preventing conception or ending early pregnancies, but these methods were dangerous and unreliable. Survival often meant developing networks of knowledge and support among other women in similar circumstances. Violence was an ever-present threat. While licensed establishments might provide some security, the nature of the work meant you were often alone with clients whose intentions weren't always benign. City guards offered little protection, and the legal system rarely took crimes against prostitutes seriously. Self-defense became a crucial skill, whether through alliances with other women, relationships with protective clients, or simply learning to read dangerous situations before they escalated. As evening approaches and your working day continues, the medieval city transforms. Taverns fill with workers spending their daily wages. Merchants close their shops and seek entertainment. The atmosphere becomes looser, more permissive, but also more unpredictable. These are your busiest hours, when demand is highest, but so are the risks. The reality was that most women in this profession didn't remain in it for their entire lives. Some managed to save enough money to establish small businesses. Others married clients who offered them a path to respectability. Many simply aged out, finding whatever work they could in their later years. Few grew old in the profession itself. Medieval prostitution existed because medieval society created conditions where it was necessary. Limited economic opportunities for women, arranged marriages that left emotional needs unmet, and a rigid social structure that provided few outlets for human desires all contributed to demand for these services. The women who provided them weren't victims or villains in any simple sense. They were survivors navigating an impossible world with whatever tools they possessed. Their stories remind us that even in history's shadows, human resilience found ways to endure, adapt, and occasionally even thrive against overwhelming odds.